Back in 2015, one single decision from the Supreme Court changed the face of one of society's oldest institutions. It was a case that started with love and loss and became a fight for basic human dignity. But really, at its core, this was a massive debate about the U.S. Constitution itself. This is the story of Obergefell v. Hodges.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll get right to the core question the court was facing. Then we're going to dig into the arguments from both sides, the majority and the dissent. After that, we'll cover the final verdict and, maybe most importantly, talk about why the conversation this case started is still very much alive today.
You know, it all really boiled down to one single, incredibly powerful question. Does the 14th Amendment, with its big promises of liberty and equal protection under the law, actually guarantee the right to marry for same-sex couples? That was it. That's the question the court had to answer.
Now, this whole firestorm didn't just appear out of thin air. The road to the Supreme Court was long. Things really heated up in 2013 when the court struck down part of the Defense of Marriage Act. After that, a bunch of lower courts started ruling in favor of same-sex marriage. But then, and this is key, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals went the other way and upheld the bans. That created what's called a circuit split, basically a huge legal contradiction where federal courts disagree. That's a signal flare that pretty much forces the Supreme Court to step in and say, okay, we need to settle this for everyone.
So let's dive into the majority opinion, the winning side, written by Justice Anthony Kennedy. What's so fascinating here is that this argument isn't just some dry, abstract legal theory. No, it's built on the very real, very human stories of the people who brought this case forward. First up, the man whose name is on the case, James Obergefell. His story is just heartbreaking. His partner, John Arthur, was terminally ill. They had to fly on a special medical transport plane to Maryland just to get legally married. When John died only 3 months later, their home state of Ohio refused to recognize their marriage. That meant James couldn't even be listed as the surviving spouse on his own husband's death certificate. The court's opinion put it starkly. The law forced them to be strangers even in death. Then you have the story of April DeBoer and Jane Rose. They were 2 nurses in Michigan, raising 3 kids with special needs together. But because state law wouldn't let them jointly adopt, each child legally had only one parent. Can you imagine living with that constant fear? If anything happened to one of them, the other would have 0 legal rights to the very children she was raising. It's a terrifying thought for any parent. And this next story really just shows how absurd the whole legal situation was. You've got an Army Reserve Sergeant, Injay Decoe, who got legally married to his partner Thomas in New York. But when they moved to Tennessee, poof! In the eyes of the law, their marriage vanished. It would literally reappear and disappear as they drove across state lines, a totally unstable foundation for life, especially for a man serving his country. So, from these deeply personal stories, Justice Kennedy built his legal case. He pointed to the court's own history and laid out 4 big ideas, or principles, about marriage. It's about individual choice. It's about a unique, committed union between 2 people. It helps protect children and families. And finally, it's a cornerstone of our society. And here's the kicker, the absolute core of his argument. Kennedy said every single one of these principles applies with equal force to same-sex couples. Now, legally, he anchored all of this in 2 giant concepts from the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. It sounds complicated, but the idea is pretty straightforward. Due process protects your fundamental liberty, and Kennedy argued the choice to marry is part of that liberty. Equal protection means the law has to treat everyone fairly. By creating 2 classes of people, those who could marry and those who couldn't, the states, you said, were denying them that equal protection. And this was the powerful climax of the majority's opinion. This wasn't just about legal paperwork or tax benefits. It was a demand for dignity. And in Justice Kennedy's final analysis, that dignity was a right granted by the Constitution itself. But remember, this was a nail-biter of a case, and there was a forceful dissent, led by Chief Justice John Roberts, that framed this whole thing in a completely different light. For the dissenters, this case wasn't really about the definition of marriage at all. It was about power. Specifically, who gets to decide, the courts or the people? Roberts basically drew a bright line in the sand. He said the job of a judge is to say what the law is, not what it should be. That second part, deciding what the law ought to be, that's the job of the legislature, the people we elect. He argued that by redefining marriage, the court wasn't acting like a court at all. It was acting like a lawmaking body. He summed up his entire argument with this one sharp question. It's so direct. He's essentially asking, what gives 5 unelected lawyers the authority to redefine an institution that has existed for millennia, overturning the will of millions of voters in the process? So the core of the dissent is this. The Constitution is silent on what marriage is. And because it's silent, that decision should be left to the democratic process. Let the people in each state debate it, vote on it, and decide for themselves. For the court to step in, Roberts argued, wasn't an act of legal judgment. It was an act of raw will. So that brings us to the moment of truth. You've heard all the arguments, the deeply personal stories on one side, and the serious constitutional warnings on the other. After all that, the court was ready to deliver its verdict. On June 26, 2015, the decision came down, and it was razor thin, a 5-4 vote, a decision that hinged on one single justice, perfectly reflecting just how divided the court and the country was on this issue.
The final ruling was sweeping and unambiguous. It did 2 huge things. First, it required every state to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, no exceptions. Second, it required every state to recognize same-sex marriages that were legally performed in other states. In an instant, that chaotic patchwork of laws was wiped away, and marriage equality became the law of the entire land.
But here's the thing with a decision this big, it doesn't really end the conversation. In fact, in a lot of ways, it just started a brand new chapter, raising all sorts of complex new questions that we're still wrestling with today. When you really boil it all down, this case came down to 2 clashing worldviews. For Kennedy and the majority, marriage is a living, evolving thing, and the court's job is to make sure fundamental rights are protected for everyone. For Roberts and the dissent, marriage has a fixed, historical definition, and the court's job is to interpret the law, not make massive social policy. 2 totally different philosophies on what marriage is and what the Supreme Court is for. And that brings us to the biggest, lingering question. One that Chief Justice Roberts himself raised in his dissent. If the right to marry is now a fundamental constitutional right, what happens when it bumps up against another one? The First Amendment's guarantee of religious freedom. That conflict, that intersection, is a legal frontier where the legacy of Obergefell is still being written today.